Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 50th episode of the Royal Society of Medicine's COVID webinars for and by health professionals. Now, it looks like this is turning into what might well be our most popular. I think we already have 3,000 people registered, and I would like to think that's a result of our successful brand and to celebrate this anniversary, but I think it isn't. I think this is to do with our guest today. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Sir Jeremy Farrar, who many of you will know has been the boss of Wellcome since 2013, but probably few will know that far from being a faceless bureaucrat, before that he was probably the world's leading epidemiologist of tropical diseases, infections and vaccination, working for many, many years in Vietnam, becoming a fellow of the Royal Society and clearly establishing himself as the number one in that field. And then 6 years at the Wellcome, and then this time, earlier this year, facing the greatest pandemic challenge we've had in at least a generation or more. It really is a question of cometh the hour, cometh the man. So welcome, Jeremy. Very nice to see you. And perhaps just for a little bit, just to start off, just to say, you know, this must have been an extraordinary time for you. Have you just been scared shitless, or have you been thinking, right, you know, now we can put things into practice that I've been wanting to do for years?
Thanks, Simon. I think I've always aspired to be a faceless bureaucrat, to be honest. I think it's the thing that, if I think back to my early days, you know, it's beyond the dreams of avarice to have reached that pinnacle. Yeah, it's been an extraordinary year, Simon, and yeah, can I just say thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation, and to have kept these going for 50, Simon, I think is a true tribute to the RSM and to you, and I'm sure whoever's joining in today is doing it because of the way you've hosted them. So thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, it's been an extraordinary year. I mean, since 1999 and the coming of Nipah virus, which very few people have heard of now, sort of emerging infections was something I did focus on in the time in Vietnam and subsequently at Wellcome. And it was very clear from December 31st, when I first heard of something happening in Wuhan from an old friend who's the head of China CDC. It was clear that this was going to be something extraordinary. But even in late January, none of us could have predicted the disruption that this would cause, and frankly, the horror that this has brought to health, to not just COVID health, but every aspect of health, mental health and everything else, as well as this disruption to societies, economics, jobs, and of course, geopolitics. So you know, none of us could have seen that even towards the end of January, when we knew it was going to be something very, very significant.
Okay, well now, sometimes I have to do a lot of preparation for these episodes, but sometimes the scripts just write themselves. And this week, we are clearly in one of those weeks. Now, I know you're a Neil Young fan, because I follow you on Twitter. So to use, unfortunately, the title of one of his worst albums, nevertheless, it would appear that we are in a fork in the road. And if you heard Sir John Bell, our 38th guest or victim on the Today programme, who announced to the total shock and joy of the presenter with some confidence that things could return to normal by spring of next year. And that clearly is the question of the day and much more. Do you agree with Sir John? So
John's Canadian, I think, originally, and spring can last a long time in Canada. And you know, it's good of John to have not become too fixed on an absolute date. I do think we're at a fork in the road. You're absolutely right. I've said since January that the way through this pandemic is ultimately going to be through science and innovation. And when I use the word science, I don't just mean biomedical science. I mean social sciences, psychology, political science. I mean the full gambit of science, because in my 4 circles, which I introduced at the start, in some ways, it is that whole aspect of science that's important, and innovation. It's not just biomedical science, but biomedical science does have a very important role to play. And the news of the last 2 weeks, I won't comment on the US election, but There's some positive, all sorts of positive things have happened in the last couple of weeks. But on the vaccine in particular, I think what that demonstrated to me is with science and innovation, you've come up not only to show that a vaccine can produce an immune response, antibodies, T cells, and all those other complex things, but it can also protect people against illness. That is a huge finding, that it's not just abstract immunology. This is protecting people. That was a huge finding. A huge number of questions still to be answered. What's the longevity of the response? Does it work in all communities and all populations, all ages, and all backgrounds? Does it work as well in people that are very poor as well as people that are very rich? Can we distribute it around the world? What's the cold chain requirements? What's it going to cost? Etc. The huge number of questions to be asked. But as I said the other night, if you can't smile at that news after 2020, then I don't know what you can, because I think it is a fork in the road. The other optimism that I take from it, because that vaccine is very novel, it's using RNA we've never had an RNA vaccine licensed anywhere, but it is targeting the spike protein. And that is the same protein that many other vaccines are targeting as well. And therefore, I think we can have a reasonable degree of optimism that the other approaches to making vaccines against COVID-19 have a good chance of succeeding as well. I don't believe this will be the only vaccine that works. And I think we can be optimistic that others will work as well. And they may have advantages in certain communities.
Okay. Well, now you cleverly asked all the questions that already are pouring in, are all variations on the theme. I think I just ticked off 8 things that you said were questions. So forgive audience if I allow Jeremy the pleasure of answering his own questions, but lots of you have asked the same. In fact, though, one Dr. Mitra Shahidi is actually asked one of those, and this is it's really about speed, that we're moving fast. And he poses the question, what about if another vaccine appears fairly soon as well that looks similar, or perhaps even more efficacy, or maybe cheaper, or maybe easier to distribute, because the distribution is not simple, is it? How would we handle this? If we're not talking about the Russian vaccine, but we're talking about plenty of very good candidates that are racing away and may well reveal results, even as we speak. How will we handle that?
Yeah, it is a great question, and I think time is actually to our advantage here, because if I call this first group of 8 or 10 vaccines that are in late stage development now globally, they are, I think, best to be seen as a portfolio rather than 8 individual vaccines. And at the moment, certainly this country, but most countries in the world are not committed actually to only one of those vaccines. Almost all those vaccines, in fact, I think all of them will need 2 doses, more or less the same length of time between the first and the second dose. And so what's important at the moment is that countries don't get fixed on only going to be delivering this one vaccine, because they are all still in development. We will learn other things, I believe, in the next month of the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, probably the Moderna vaccine, maybe other vaccines that we'll learn of the results of, including from China, between now and the end of the year. And I think the important thing as we set up the logistics and the communication strategy, and we start to build, I hope, the degree of trust in the public in these vaccines, that we don't become narrow-minded and think it's all about the Pfizer vaccine or it's all about one of the others. There may be advantages in cold chain, in logistics. Some vaccines may work better in senior people, others may work better in certain communities. We've got to retain the idea of a portfolio here rather than get fixed on any one.
Okay, well, Russell Locke has asked what's an immediate follow-up question to that is, would it be ever desirable or likely that you could perhaps get 2 vaccines at the same time, an individual?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question. Is the question you get let's name the companies because it's the easiest, but an RNA vaccine and an adeno vaccine at the same time?
Yes, that's exactly the question.
I would not advise that. I think these are still, they've They've been developed very quickly. We've not developed a vaccine in less than a year in history. I think that partially reflects advances in science and advances in organization rather than, in my view, speeding up the process. But these are still vaccines that have been developed quickly. We will learn things about them over time. I believe that I have complete trust in the MHRA in this country, the regulator, in the FDA in America, and the European Medicines Agency in Europe, and other regulators around the world, and indeed the WHO, to be absolutely politically independent and robust in their assessment of safety and of efficacy. But inevitably, you learn more about vaccines in the medium and long term than you do through the phase 3 trials. And I would caution against combining vaccines that have never been combined in any clinical trial up to this point. So I think it's important that when somebody starts on one vaccine schedule, they stick with that schedule rather than complicating it by having multiple different vaccines.
And on that topic, I'm afraid I now can't even read my own writing of who said this, but someone's just asked. Okay, so not at the same time, but do you think, for example, the RNA vaccines, mRNA vaccines will prove superior to vector vaccines in the longer term? Or do you think it's just, you just don't know? Or do you think there's a reason?
I just don't think we know, Simon. I think that, I do think this is a moment we will look back on as a time when vaccines in particular, this was a disruptive technological advance. And I think we'll look back on the advances made in 2020 and say that was a moment when science really did make a leap forward, and the technological advantages of these vaccines will come to be profound, whether the vector-based ones, the adeno, or the RNA vaccines. I think we will see a different scientific and manufacturing and distribution and equitable access to these vaccines in the future than we've perhaps had in the past. And I think this really does represent a leap forward, which we will come to celebrate in due course. And just to finish off on that, I also think if we try to look forward where this is taking us, I think there will be something of a blurring of the margins in the future of what we call a vaccine and what we call a therapeutic. I think those are, there's a lot of work on mRNA technology for therapeutics as well, a lot of work on the biologics for treatment of cancer, of infectious diseases, and maybe in your area, Simon, in mental health as well. I'm less familiar, but I think we will see a blurring of the margins of what we call a vaccine and what we call a therapeutic in the future. And these disruptive technologies, I think, will allow us to do that. And I believe will also allow us to have a more equitable and accessible approach, because I think the manufacturing technology has also advanced so that we can have a much better distributed model for the manufacturing of these vaccines and treatments, which will allow much greater global access.
I mean, Jeremy, normally in your media appearances, I have to say you are quite gloomy. You're not always a ray of sunshine on these things, but suddenly you are. Does that mean that what you said earlier in the year, that we'll never be able to be free, we'll have to learn to live with COVID, we'll never be free of COVID? Are you actually reassessing that view now? Or do you think that we still, though, will have to find terms of coming to terms with this in some shape or form?
I'm sorry, I've been gloomy, Simon.
It's a gloomy situation, Jeremy.
It's not been my intention, but 2020 has been a bit of a gloomy year all round, really, and I don't think any of us would want to repeat it. But I do feel much more optimistic coming into the last quarter of 2020, and actually, even though I'm across as gloomy. And I don't mean to say I have some magic ball, but actually I always thought we'd be in this place in the latter quarter of 2020, because I do believe that scientists and science and global cooperation has been absolutely unprecedented. And I think, frankly, you're seeing the advances in vaccine development now, which have come about because of years of investment in this country, in around the world, in science. And if ever there was a moment to thank scientists and funders for backing that sort of stuff, it's now, because Because without the science that we have available to us now, mRNA, adeno prime boost, whatever it is, we wouldn't be where we are today without that investment over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And it's a huge tribute, and also international cooperation. I think it's fantastic that the Pfizer vaccine, for instance, came out of a German biotech run by two people. Family came from Turkey, were able to set up in Germany. It's now got the backing of a multilateral organization, and that has been repeated with the Oxford AstraZeneca, the Johnson & Johnson work, and indeed the Chinese vaccine. So I think we've made great progress. Yeah, I do feel optimistic, but Simon, this virus is now, in my view, part of humanity. It is an endemic infection now. And I don't think it's going to go away. I think we will have to learn to live with it. And I think that vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, clinical care, public health, societal support for people who suffer from it as part of health is now where it will be. But I'm damn glad that we will have drugs and vaccines and diagnostics to help us through that, as with every other infection. And I hope what we've learned in the last during 2020 will not just be relevant for COVID-19, but will actually help us think about how do we make vaccines and treatment for TB, for malaria, for mental health issues, for cancer therapies. I think we will look back on 2020 and say, what a great year for innovation.
Okay, and one more follow-up question just on that. It's a slightly nerdy question, but it's a good one. It's from Paul Hunter. Now, let's say the Pfizer vaccine is effective and we have an effective vaccine. Now we get into a slight problem with ongoing trials that are placebo, or indeed new trials that want to go against placebo, because we're now into the ethical dilemma of what we call inferiority trials. What will happen to the existing large-scale stage 3 trials once it's a bit like, a state has declared, using the American election? It changes the dynamics of the other states. So what will happen there? The non-inferiority trials will then be necessary.
Yeah, it is, Paul. It's a great question, and I'm not an ethicist, and that is why it's so important that not just now tagged on at the end, but people who are very much more expert in this and around the world have been involved in starting to think these things through actually months ago. It's not the first time we've faced this. Peter Smith, I think one of the greatest epidemiologists certainly I've ever worked with from the London School, and Brian Greenwood actually raised this 20 years ago. What would we do when we have new vaccines, which may be imperfect? How will we improve those vaccines going forward? And how do we frame that in an ethical way to make sure that we're not denying people access to good things whilst trying to produce better things? And I don't have a simple answer to this. I do think that, I do think science will be our friend here. I think there are ways that once we can work out what are the biomarkers, what are the immunological correlates of protection, we will maybe be able to bridge studies. This is what we did with Ebola. The Johnson & Johnson Ebola vaccine was able to bridge immunologically to show efficacy, to show protection to the VSV vaccine that ultimately Merck developed. And so that we now have two licensed Ebola vaccines, VSV from Merck and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine for Ebola, without having to go through what would be very, very challenging ethical phase 3 trials for both vaccines going head to head when you knew the VSV from Merck worked. So I do think there's precedent in history for this. I do think that science will show us what are the surrogate markers of protection, and that we'll be able to do bridging immunological studies when we have more than one vaccine, so that we won't just have first generation vaccines, but we'll have second and ultimately third generation vaccines in the future. Okay,
great answer, thank you. And one more, again, no, it's not a technical question at all. It's actually, there's still some of the questions flooding through show a certain still slight suspicion of pharma. And this is really going to the article in the Times Higher just a couple of days ago. At the moment, some companies are kind of like Coca-Cola, hanging on to the kind of secret sauce or whatever, the magic ingredient of their vaccine for whatever reasons. And there was a call that researchers should not collaborate with pharma unless there is full transparency, including that. Do you think that's a fair point? Or
so I don't agree with the extreme that where you ended that, and as a provocative question, because I do think that there has to be, if we're going to have innovation, if we're going to take science through into making a difference to people's lives, that there has to be respect and protection of that, of ultimately that intellectual property. And I'm not suggesting for a second that we've got this right at the moment, but nevertheless, I do think that is an important thing if we want to have innovation and if we want to see science go through to being available to people and to prove health. But just to come back on that, I think this is also behoven on the public sector, and I include philanthropy on that, in the public sector, not completely outsourcing the whole of the pharmacological and healthcare industry, to make sure that the public sector is also able to say, these are the things we want, these are the things we need, and we're going to be willing to pay for those. And as we all know, there are some aspects of health which have no commercial driver, and frankly, we've outsourced too much. Drug-resistant infections are one of those. No commercial driver for new antibiotics. We have to solve that problem. There's no commercial driver for epidemic diseases which may never happen, which is why we've got into this problem here with a new disease. It was what drove the setting up of CEPI in 2017 to say this is a public responsibility that must come with public funding, but I wouldn't suggest we bring the innovation and the scientific into, I wouldn't suggest that the public sector drives the innovation and commercialization of those, but we've got to find a better way that the public sector can drive and influence the way that we produce products which are absolutely critical for society, but which there is no commercial driver at the moment. Antibiotics, great example. Epidemic disease is a great example. Mental health may be a great example, where the public sector needs to drive and tell the private sector what it needs and be willing to pay for it, and set up a different construct than just saying, produce these things and we'll buy from you at the end, because they're not happening, and we've got to change that model.
Okay. Now, Wellcome is an international organization. Your career has been in international global health. It's fair to say, well, at the moment, people felt very happy to think that the restrictions, etc., that we've been living in could be lifted in this country. And it's a tribute to the kind of misery we've had for the last months, just, how elated all the news people were, all those clips of them leaping up and down, and John Bell doesn't normally have that effect. But is it true though, if we just look at ourselves and we don't think about the global picture, that we won't get anywhere, that this is not socialism in one country, this is a global phenomenon?
Yeah, I don't know where to start, really. I mean,
we haven't got very long, because I've got to remind you, you're going to Sage at 1 o'clock. So
yeah, I've let them know I can be 5 minutes late.
Oh, okay, that's great.
Epidemics for me are the sort of horrible poster child of the things we're going to face in the 21st century, and the drivers of epidemics, changes of behavior in animal and humans, changing environment, ecology, urbanization, trade and travel, climate change, means that the challenges we're going to face, whether it be epidemics, drug-resistant infections, inequality, access to water, energy, climate change, whatever it is, these are not going to be national. And I think in the last 5 or 10 years, there was a grave danger that, and I think essentially the world looked into what I describe as the abyss of nationalism. We flirted with it in various countries. It's not a political point, but we have flirted with it. And I think if COVID doesn't remind us that the challenges of our time are going to be driven by a need for international cooperation, collaboration, and an absolute proactive approach to inequality and to access, then we will lead into very severe tensions in the 21st century, which ultimately, I believe, will lead into conflict. We learned that in the 20th century, and we must not repeat those in the 21st century at all. And so therefore, I think we flirted with the abyss of nationalism, and I hope that we're coming through that, and humanity has looked at itself and said we have to work together as a world. And I think the scientists around the world have actually driven that through COVID. They've worked, they've collaborated, they've shared their information. And I think that is to be applauded and shows us a way through. And I hope that is where the political class takes us in the coming years.
Yeah, brilliant answer, if I may say so. Thank you. Okay, we will still move swiftly though. We can't deprive Sage of your services. So now Ian Harvey, Janet Milton, and several others asked questions. We mentioned Neil Young. I actually like musicals, and this is from Guys and Dolls. Take Back Your Mink, a great song in the second act. So this is about minks and viral mutation. Should we be worried about the minks in Denmark or not?
So I think Denmark have responded very well, I should say that, and also pay tribute to Marion Koopmans in the Netherlands, who also raised this issue actually in the Netherlands some while ago. I don't think the issue of the minks themselves is the big problem, that the reason why this is so worrying. The reason why this is so worrying is it shows how promiscuous this virus is, and that it is very able to leap from certainly bats and then probably some intermediate hosts in China in some point in 2019 and came across to humans. And what the minks demonstrate to us and remind us of is that it can go back the other way, and it can then evolve, it can then become an endemic animal virus as well. And minks are obviously if you like, I hate too many analogies, but minks are essentially the canary here in the coal mine. They're telling us that this virus can jump back and forth between human and animals. It could easily get established in an animal population, not minks that are farmed in Denmark, but other rodents, ferrets, voles, potentially other rodents, rats, mice, etc., and allow it to evolve in those animal populations and then come back in future years. Into the human population as a revolving door in a way. And to me, that's the worry of the mink story rather than the minks themselves. And once that happens, you're putting both human and animal pressure on the spike protein and other proteins such that you will see continued evolution. And I think that's the concern rather than those poor minks that all lost their lives in Denmark.
Okay, thank you. And then a slightly more general questions come up, two really. One is the other great news this week, obviously, is the, Donald Trump is behaving like some dictator in Belarus or somewhere and refusing to accept results of elections. But let's assume that history takes its course. Do you think that will have a positive effect on both the CDC in America and also on global health?
I'm a great fan of Belarus, Simon. I wouldn't want Belarus dragged into.
You may not be a great fan of its government.
This is not a party political point. I'm completely neutral between the left and the right, and whatever else you might call politicians around the world. But I do think that there is a danger of us all taking a more nationalistic approach. There is, I've said that already, and I think anything in this country, in the United States, in China, in India, Brazil, anything which can shift us into a shared humanity. And that sounds melodramatic and squidgy and soft and idealistic and the rest of it. It would be fitting in the Iliad, Simon, if we were able to say that. Because you should remember that Iliad pointed out epidemics in its early days, as you know very well. But I think what the election does show is that there is still a commitment to working together across borders. And I am pleased with some of the early comments. I think the world has benefited from US leadership in the last 70 years. It's never been perfect. Of course, it never will be. But I think that the ledger is very much in the positive compared to the negative. And I think the world is better when we have an engaged and involved United States, when we have a really strong Center for Disease Control in the United States. It's been, in my view, the best public health agency in the world, and we've all learned from it. And I think we are better when those institutions are strong in countries. And as well as the comment earlier about the abyss of nationalism, I worry about the undermining of national and global institutions, because I think in the end, institutional strength is really critically important to deal with the day-to-day, but also have the resilience and surge capacity when things change. And the undermining of institutions, I think, is a very, very dangerous path to go down.
Understood. Now, I think I'm turning to a sundial again on that classical theme, so I may have to switch my position once more. But very last question's been asked, which is that in the end, I mean, you've been a major voice for science. You've also been very public, as have many other scientists, Chris Whitty and many others. Do you think that in the end, we will find a better public voice for science and medicine? Or on the other view is that we have been, tested and found wanting. So do you think, the issue of the role of science, I know numbers of people going to medical school has soared, hasn't it? But what do you think has happened? That's what someone else asked, when this is over.
Yeah, I would like to specifically start at this point, though, that having watched at very close quarters the role Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance have played has been nothing short of extraordinary. And they deserve, I have to say, all of our respect, all of our thanks, and all of our support, because I think what they have gone through has been extraordinary. And having watched both of them at very close quarters, I just have enormous respect for the role they've played, and publicly would like to thank them. I think science has got to also understand that science and scientists are part of the society in which science and they thrive. And science can never go back into an ivory tower of its own community and talk to itself. Science it's part of culture, it's part of society, and we need to see, without becoming overtly, certainly party political, but science cannot hide it behind a shroud anymore. It is part. And frankly, I think there's a great opportunity here. That I don't think there's been a year in the last probably 100 years when science has been so front and central to the national debate. That has been very exposing, and scientists have made mistakes. I have made mistakes. Patrick and Chris would be the first to say they've made mistakes, but science has been front and center. The public are much more engaged in science now than certainly in my professional life they've ever been. That is a very positive development. And I think we as scientists have got to learn, how do we work in that new world? How do we make the most of science and have the humility that science brings to not promise more than we can deliver? And to how do we keep to the broad range of science that it involves? And again, I go back to social sciences as well as physics, chemistry, and the biomedical sciences. I think we have to think very hard about how we're going to position this in the future. What we cannot do is go back to ivory towers or think we're not part of society or culture again, because we won't be. And I think there are major lessons to be learned that we all need to reflect on there.
I think on that point, we're going to have to let you go. Firstly, can I first of all thank the Wellcome, because by the way, I think it was great what you said about Chris and Patrick. I think they really deserve it, and I know they watch some of these, so hopefully they'll accept our invitation to come onto the program. Second, my career started with a Wellcome Training Fellowship, so I've always been indebted to the Wellcome completely, and it would have been very, very different without that. So we tried to persuade John Edmonds, who left us to go on to Sage, to leave his mic and video on. He refused, but I'm hoping, given the person you are, you might do that so we can all enjoy the meeting of Sage that I know you have to go to, but I know you now to leave. And so thank you so much. That was just brilliant, by the way. Thank you very, very much indeed. Now, the rest of you who are just staying.
Simon, thank you. And Simon, when you hang up your day job, talk to the media, and you've got a second life with a interviewing technique, which is both very frightening, very frightening, but also entertaining. So, Simon, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you. Now, folks who are watching, there's about 120 unanswered questions. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be having our wrap up with Pete Oppenshaw, Trish Greenall, and one of the directors of WHO Europe, Walter Riccaelli. So some of them we will return to at that date. So sorry to all those who couldn't get those questions answered, but I think you'll agree that that was a pretty powerful program, and but there's lots more to ask, and we will get round to you. And next week, we will be back talking about the African experience, which again, I think Jeremy would have had a lot to say on, but with another old favorite, Ebereke will be chairing, and the panel is also one of the very best we've ever had. In the meantime, can I remind you that RSM, that you get all this for free, but the RSM, like everyone else, has its begging bowl out in these hard times until the good times return. We can't wait. That can't happen to us soon enough. But do please feel able to support what we're doing up until then. So once again, thanks for watching. Sorry that I turned into a human sundial halfway through, and I'm about to do so again. And we'll see you next week for the In Conversation, which will be Roger Kirby will be talking to Marcus Setchell, Queen's obstetrician, and then exactly a week today, it'll be on the African experience. Thanks very much. Good afternoon to you all. See you next time.